Yesterday we got introduced to Programmatic UI. Today we will take our knowledge from yesterday and our prior knowledge with Storyboards and also Xibs, right? We saw Xibs briefly at the beginning of Unit 4. So we'll take everything that we've known so far and we'll create an app, right? So we'll create an app using not storyboards, Programmatic, set up the UI programmatically in our scene delegate. Then we'll go on, we'll create a view controller in code. We'll create a view controller using Storyboard. We'll access that storyboard file from code. And we'll also use a zib file to create our custom cell, right? So at the end of this lecture, you'll be able to mix and match storyboard, code, and Xibs. Everybody with me? Right? So that's the objective of this lesson here.
Would that all be programmatic?
Yes. So the starter project already has what we had yesterday. So it set up everything in the scene delegate. We'll go over it, what it looks like. But it starts off without any storyboard, right? So if you need a storyboard, you need to create it, which we'll do today. So at the end of the lecture, you'll be able to create your own storyboards per view controller, for instance. Including zip, yeah. So you'll have all the power of getting anything you want to work together. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we're doing a view controller, a detail view controller, but the detail, so the view controller is a collection.
The view controller is a collection view, yes.
And then the detail view controller will be just like what we did yesterday, which is the regular.
Yeah, just the regular, it's gonna be a storyboard, not yesterday, because yesterday we had no storyboard.
Okay, no, what I mean, like yesterday, I just meant as far as like, it's like just one view, not a table view or a collection view, just the regular view.
Our app is going to be 2 view controllers. The first view controller will show the podcast. I click on it and I go to a detail showing like a bigger image of the podcast with some detail, right? But the cell that's going to power our collection view will be a zip. Cool? So we'll see concepts there that allows us to mix and match regardless of what we're doing. So we could access storyboard, we could do code, we could do zip, right? Cool?
Is this just like where is this practically used for practice? Are you just doing this for practice or?
It exists. It exists. It exists in the wild. It exists in the wild, right? You might start with storyboards and just go to code. You might start with code and then you use storyboard. But as you go into group projects, that could come in very handy as well, right? Maybe there's concepts in the app where you want to do in code. Maybe there's somebody that probably rather do some view controller in storyboard. But if you have that's a good question there, especially with group projects. If you have one giant main storyboard with all your scenes in there, it causes a lot of merge conflicts when you work on a team, right? So the minute you open up that storyboard file, it shows a change. Somebody else opens up that storyboard file, it shows a change, you got merge conflicts. So if people are able to separate what they work on, like I work on the podcast detail controller, it has its own storyboard. I work on the favorite detail controller, it also has its own storyboard. That way, each person is working on their own storyboard. You don't have one gigantic storyboard file, right? Cool? Very good. Yes, sir.
I kind of want to understand what the advantage is doing that what you just demonstrated. So when working in a group, would it be better to do the UI programmatically?
If you're working in a group, you want to break up code as much as possible, meaning you do not want to have one giant main storyboard with every view controller in there, right? So as we'll have our first group project, we might give you guys certain instructions to say, this part should be in code and that part should be in storyboard.
I'm trying to get to like why the advantage would be if doing it like half and half like that.
Uh-huh.
Or in terms of
It could be design. The designer probably wants to see the zip file, which is easier to see visually, right? And to set up code for a cell for a different view might be easier in code. So it's on a piece by piece case basis.
So it's
Preference of workflow, preference of developer, preference of what code you have existing.
or what the group determined should be done.
Exactly. Or where you could have less merge conflicts, right? Whatever that question that you're trying to solve is, The minute we get more experience with programmable UI and storyboards, we will, as developers, know which one we prefer, right? But when the designer comes in, there's a different thing there, right? The designer wants to see right away, what is my cell going to look like? So there you could have a zip, right? As opposed to like, hey, I have the thing in code, the designer says, okay, can you move it 1 pixel? You gotta run it each time, as opposed to changing some constraint on your zip file. Does that make sense?
So it's going to be dynamic, kind of like what your scope is going to be, and you just kind of think about it quickly.
Exactly, exactly. And it could be very political too. This is a political topic, by the way. There's a lot of politics there. Storyboards versus code, right? You could just put it into Google, it becomes really political really quickly.
So it might be a work ethic.
Yes, right? Where people are like, yuck, I hate storyboards, right? But if you have a client job that's you're working on and it already has storyboards, you have to work with it. Unless you want to have your own budget funding that, right? Some other people just like to work with storyboards because storyboards got way better now, right? You could see things visually, you could prototype faster, right? If you want to prototype something, storyboards faster, right? If you're working with a team, somebody on the team might be like, oh my God, I don't want to work with storyboards, there's too many merge conflicts there. Regardless of how much you break it down, they'll be like, I just do not want storyboards in my code. Right? So knowing how to mix and match it will make that experience, your experience better, because now you're not tied to one form or the other.
So the idea really is to learn this to be flexible in our approach.
Yep, in your approach at your job, because at your job you'll have, I don't know if any of you guys ask about storyboards and code today to Adam, right? That's like one of the questions there. Like, what do you guys use, right? But in my old job, I saw both, right? I saw both. Say I'm working on a CBS app. There's a zip file there. I'm not gonna delete that file and restart all over. That's budget, that's time, right? I'll take the zip file, I'll update the custom cell class for it, and change the outlets around, right?
And that's relatively easy. So.
Exactly, exactly. So you're not rebuilding what you have already. Cool? So it both shows us how to work with multiple parts of UI, right, experience. It also gets us ready for our own projects. It gets us ready for client projects, our job as well. Cool? Very good, yeah, good. All right, so any other questions about objectives here? So the objective is to mix code, storyboards, and Xibs to work on an app, right? Especially as we're going forward into our first group project. And as I said before, you never want to have one giant storyboard with all the views in it. If you have a storyboard yourself right now, after this class here, if you're working on your own app, and your files, like your scenes, you probably have, whatever, 6, 7 scenes. At some point, that's too much scenes, because it also takes a while to load. I don't know if anybody has like 8, 10 scenes yet in their app. It takes a while to load that one storyboard file. So you want to start breaking that up and making your segue in code. Because we saw segues before in code, how to get access to a storyboard. So you want to break that up. Because on our low resource laptops, it also is very slow to load that one giant main storyboard file. Yeah?
You did like a segue in or you did a navigation controller for scene.
Yesterday.
Yeah, but then you also have something where you instantiate a view controller and segue that way.
Yes, instantiate from storyboard, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we'll be doing today.
Okay, so they're both the same thing though?
Not exactly, because the storyboard instantiation has its outlets already. If it has outlets, right? If you have your storyboard scene already, you probably have an image view, you maybe have a label. If you instantiate from storyboard, you also get all that. But if you go to, say, the scene delegate, and you say initialize some view controller, open parents, close parents, it doesn't have anything. It's empty. Yesterday, our view controller in storyboard, in the scene delegate, it didn't have any outlets. It was a completely empty storyboard view controller, correct? Yeah. Yesterday, when we had the colors app.
So you can set it up that way to begin with?
You could set it up that way to begin with, yes. So you could get that instance from storyboard. That was the question? Yeah. So at some point, you could get instances wherever you want. That's what we're trying to equip us with, because we don't want to tie us to one way. That's not the developer way. The developer way, you have many tools in your toolbox. You need to know which one to use, and you know with more experience which one to use when. right? Some of those tools will just be easier because you just like them better, whether it be Storyboard or Programmatic. But if your employer comes to you, he's like, hey, can you work on this client app where there's only code in there? You won't say, oh, I've never worked with code, or I do not like to work with code. You work on the thing, right? And you move to the other project. Very good. All right, so what's our app? Quickly, our markup is our first view controller is a podcast view controller. Podcast view controller has a collection view of cells. That cell has an image and it has 2 labels. It's a podcast app, similar to what we've done before. If I click on one of the cells, it segues to my podcast detail controller. This is going to be done in Storyboard. So the detail controller will be done in Storyboard. We'll actually create a Storyboard file called podcast detail.storyboard. And we'll name the view controller podcast detail controller. One of the best practices way to name the storyboard as the same as the view controller. So that storyboard is associated with that view controller. So podcast detail controller has a podcast detail storyboard. Our first view controller will be done all in code. That'll give us an opportunity to see how to set up a collection view in code, because we haven't seen that, right? There's a bit more complications in there as opposed to a table view. Table view is very easy to set up. Anybody remember one of the parts of a collection view that's needed in order for it to work as a collection view? A collection view needs this thing in order for it to, what? Custom cell, table view also has custom cell. What does a collection view have and a table view does not? That's one, yes. But it could still work, right? It just won't have a label or whatever. But a collection view needs this. Scroll direction, where does scroll direction come from? The scroll direction comes from flow layout, right? So see Jahid for your collection view questions. So a collection view needs a flow layout. So before you set up your collection view, you need a flow layout. So we'll see what that is in code. In Storyboard, we have it by default. If we drag in a collection view, we have in Attributes Inspector, we see the flow that we got introduced to. It has a flow already, right? I pointed us to the Attributes Inspector. It has a flow with a direction by default. But in code, you have to provide a layout before you set up your collection view. Yes, sir. Oh, the resizing, that's a good question actually. I'll answer that question either in today or later, but that's a good question. Very good question. Is it by default the resizing cells, right? Good question. All right, so remember collection view needs a flow layout. All right, next, so our cell will be created from a zip file like we did in post unit 3. We'll create a zip file for our cell, and our cell will power our collection view. Cool? All right. And we have some steps with the Xibs there, which I will talk about later, but for now, let's just go to code. Let's run our app and see what state it is in. All right, so I run my app, and at minimum, we should see podcast as the title, right? Let's go through the code we have so far. So back to what we did yesterday. My app delegate, there's no code in there. We didn't add anything in there because we said our app delegate pre-iOS 13, if we do view code, we put it in there, right? But iOS 13, if you want to set up your UI programmatically, you do it in the scene delegate, you do it in the function called will connect to session. So same thing as we did yesterday. We set up the window scene. We set up the window with the UI screen that bounced there. We set up our root controller, and we made the window visible, right? So we showed the window, and we made it visible. What do we have? We have an API client, right? Same as we had API clients before. Our API client basically returns us an array of podcasts, right, or an error. It takes in some name. For now, we're not using any search bar, right? The objective of the lesson is not to talk about search, or not to create a search bar. The objective of the lesson is to set up our UI programmatically and use storyboards and Xibs as well. So we have our API client, it works, it returns us an array of podcasts. We have our model, the podcast model. It has an artist name, collection name. It has a image URL, 100 by 100 points. And it has a larger image, which we'll use for the detail controller, which is 600 points. We have our podcast view, which is very skeleton right now. We don't have anything in there. This is where we'll add our collection view, right? So that's the first place we'll start writing code. And our view controller doesn't have much right now either. What do we have here? We set up our podcast view like we did yesterday with a view. We added the view in the load view. We'll be fetching our podcast, fetch podcast here, calls fetch podcast, and that sets up our collection view. And we have some stub collection view data source methods, right? Again, this is not done. We're not returning a hard-coded 50. All right, so first stop, let's go to our podcast view and create a collection view. So we've never seen collection view in code. We'll see collection view in code now, and we'll get a chance again to do it in our lab today. So let's create a collection view. So collection view. UI collection view. Okay. What did we say we needed for a collection view? We needed a flow layout. So let's go ahead and create a layout. We make it a public lazy var, so if we need any instance properties, we could use it right there. We don't have to wait till, let me say that again. We make it a public lazy var because we do not want to instantiate it as we write it, right? We want to instantiate it when it's called, right? When it's called in our view controller, it will get called. It will get created, sorry. It will get created as needed, okay?
And the reason why we don't see this when we have our storyboard, because it would already be what?
In storyboard, we drag, right? We drag directly to the view controller. But here, we're actually encapsulating more view code in the view class. So there's less view code in the view controller. Right? The less view code you have in the view controller, the better. So here we have a layout, UI collection view flow layout. Okay. What does the layout need? Greg, you said it earlier? Scroll direction. So a layout provides scroll direction. So scroll direction here. In our case here, we want it to scroll vertically, so we simply set it to vertical. Again, this is what you get for free almost in Attributes Inspector. When you drag a collection view, by default, it's vertical. It's up to you to change it to horizontal if you want. But here we're doing it in code, we have to say everything we want. We could also give it an item size here that we could change later. So I could say item size, expects a CG size. A CG size has width and height. So for now, I could simply return 400 by 400, for example. Okay, so we have a layout. Now we could go ahead and create our collection view. So collection view, UI collection view, initializer. And we opt in to use the collection view initializer with the frame and the collection view layout. So we scroll down to frame. We'll give it a frame of 0 for now because we'll use auto layout constraints. And the collection view layout is the layout we just created. So for CG frame, we'll simply say CG rect dot 0. And for the layout, we will pass in layout. What did I do here? 1 second, sorry. It needs frame, right? So frame, we said CG rect dot 0, and for layout. CGRX 0 is basically 0 everywhere. So 0, 0 for X, 0 for Y, 0 for width, 0 for height.
Which is what we do in the storyboard already.
Actually, this one just creates like an empty frame, right? Because 0 width is nothing. 0 pixels, right?
Gosh.
Right? But later in auto layout, we'll lay it out ourselves where we want it to, right? We just give it a default. Basically, it's like initializing an integer to 0, right?
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, very good. And here we would just return our collection view. Okay. And again, this lazy var is very similar to a function. So you write like a function for this collection view. And when you need it, you call the function, it returns you the value. Everybody with me? Right? Picture our lazy var here like a function. We write in a function, and as we need the function, we call it. So you could make that function very complex. But it has the power of being lazily initialized as you need it. All right, so here we have our collection view. Great. Okay, that's good. We could give it a background color for now. If in case the layout doesn't show, you'll come back and change it later when we're done. So here we'll say yellow or green or purple, any color you choose. So we have our collection view. Great. And again, the must-haves is the layout. You must have a layout or else your app will crash, saying it doesn't have a layout. So you need a layout. All right, let's go on here. Let's create our private function to set up collection view constraints. Can I scroll down? Are we good here? All right. Okay, so set up collection view constraints. What's the first thing we do when we set up our views? Add subview. And here is collection view. What's the next thing we do? Translate mask to false. And again, this happens automatically in Storyboard when you set up auto layout. Take this out of here. And next up, we'll use NS layout constraints. Activate all constraints. Okay, on our collection view, we'll set it up such that our collection view top anchor is constrained to, what do we want to constrain to? We'll constrain to the safe area layout guide.top. Anytime you're dealing with like the top or the bottom, remember to use the safe area layout guide. So if in case there is a bar at the top or the bottom, you're not going below that bar. Everybody? Everybody? Okay. So collection view top anchor, this is good. Next up, collection view will go to the leading anchor. And we say leading anchor constraint to leading anchor. Next we'll say bottom anchor. What are we constraining bottom anchor to?
Bottom
Safe area, very good. And lastly, we'll constrain the trailing. So trailing, anchor, constraint to trailing.
Does it matter the order that you do?
No, doesn't. Good question. Doesn't matter the order. I tend to do it counterclockwise, but it doesn't really matter. For the top or the bottom, because there's no bars on the side. At least not yet, right? Hopefully, never. So there could be a top bar at the top, or in our case, for the X phones, there's a notch. So you don't want to go beyond that. Cool? And always take a look at the human interface guideline here and there, right? Because the human interface guideline has a lot more that we don't exactly cover in class, but as iOS developers, you want to know what's happening in the human interface guidelines, or the HIG. All right, so make sure to call your setup. Make sure to call your setup collection view constraints in your common init. What's that?
I would say
Where's Shania? It's so hot. We gotta load that down, man. We gotta load that down. How we doing? We good? Continue? Yes. You what? No, no, no. I'm not moving yet. I'm right there.
If we run it, it should. Oh, well, that's not gonna work yet.
Yeah. You can fill in the pieces.
No, because we have to go to view control and make that do that. Oh.
You can do it.
Okay, so then already. Oh, it shows blue.
Rock stars. Continue? All right, cool. So we have our collection view set up. We'll go over to our podcast view controller. We have our podcast view on line 13 set up. We have an instance of it. We use that instance to set up our view in load view. We go down to view the load. We have some system background color. We set up our nav title. Now let's go ahead and run it. What color did I have? Yellow? All right. So we have our collection view. At minimum, we should have a collection view. Everybody? Our color, our whatever color we chose, we should see that. That's why I say it's useful to use background colors when you're setting up code, UI code, right? At least visually you see, yes, it's working. Next up, let's go ahead and set up our collection view as far as the delegate and data source are concerned. So right here, we'll say podcast view dot collection view dot data source equal to self. Build it. If we run it, we should get some cells for now, I think. Let's see. Ooh, what happened there?
You said podcast view dot what?
Podcast view dot collection view equal to self. You're setting up the data source for the collection view.
Oh, like data source.
Yep. Okay, what's happening here? Who could tell me the error?
Wait, wait.
You scroll up.
Podcast view dot
It crashes. What's the error? I'm not gonna scroll
I
up.
have a question. Why are you making the collection view on the podcast view data source equal to that?
We want for our view controller to be the data source for the collection view, like we always do.
Right.
But the view is just coming from someplace else.
Oh, we don't have a collection view at all.
Yeah. What's the error? Who's telling me the error here? The cell identifier, right? So what's the cell identifier say? What does it say? What does the error actually say?
It doesn't have. Oh wait, mine worked.
What's the actual error? Shania, what's the error? What error are we getting? Could not dequeue, right? Could not dequeue a cell. So if we scroll up here, right? Must have, right here, there's the error. It's looking for a cell. It cannot find a cell. It's saying must register a nib or zib. If you see nib, nibs and zibs are the same, right? So either you register a nib or have a class identifier in Storyboard. We don't have any of those, right? We have our collection view, but our collection view is not registering a cell. We do not have any Storyboard, right? There's no Storyboard, there's no zib, we're not registering our cell anywhere. So let's go fix that. And we'll see how to register a cell in code. Because remember, when you have your storyboard, you click on your cell, correct? And you go give it an identifier. That's what we have to do in code. We have to do that in code, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So right in our view did load here, I'll say register collection view cell. Or register, yeah, collection view cell. What does that look like? So we'll say podcast view dot collection view dot register. So the initializer we use is register cell for identifier. That line is very similar to going to Storyboard, giving it an identifier, and giving it a custom cell. Everybody? That one line there is what we do in Storyboard. So, what does the cell look like? If we're using the default UI collection view cell, we have to specify it here by saying UI collection view cell dot self, and we give it an identifier. We'll call it podcast cell. So by saying UI collection view cell dot self is similar to not registering a custom cell, right? Going with the default cell in Storyboard. Everybody? But you need to specify an identifier. So we did that. We also specified an identifier. And make sure that identifier is as we wrote it there, because it's expecting that in our cell for row or cell for item. So we're using camel case there for the podcast cell. And run the app again. Yes, sir. We don't have a custom cell yet.
Oh, okay.
We're getting there. Yeah. Giving us a custom cell would not be exactly correct because we've seen it once, but we haven't done it multiple times. So we'll create it again from scratch. So you should be able to run your app again and not get that crash we had earlier, unless the identifier is misspelled, right?
Where do we give
Where do we give
that identifier?
this one?
Yeah.
Down in our cell for row, here. Cool?
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So it's no longer like, because before technically we would have our storyboard, we would put the cell name in the storyboard.
Yes.
And then we would bring it here and make sure it's the same.
Exactly.
But now here we're giving it its name into the collection view. and
Ex-
set it up.
exactly.
And then when we're ready to run it, we want to make sure that
The names match.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay, perfect. So let's go. Any other questions? So what Tiffany is saying there is just reinforcing the point that we register in the cell, not in storyboard because there's no storyboard. We register in the cell in code. All right. Let. Let's change the color first. 1 second, and I'll come right to you. So change your cell color to white, for example. Okay. Change your cell color to some color so you actually see the color of the cell. So in your cell for row, change the background color and run the app again.
It's not UI collection view, I think that's the same.
Yeah, UI collection view cell.
Oh, UI collection view cell.
Yeah. Right, everybody? It's not a UI collection view. We register in a cell here. We're basically saying we want to use the default UI collection view cell. You have to register. The collection view has to register a cell. In Storyboard, when we have our collection view cell, we click on it, we go give it an identifier, and we use the default cell unless we have a custom cell. They do. The default cell just doesn't have any elements on it. Right? Everybody, clarification here. There's a collection view cell, it exists. It's just not as the table view. The table view has what? A text label, right? A cell text label, detailed text label, image view, right? A collection view doesn't have any labels, but it has a cell. Like when I drag in my collection view, it has a default cell, right? But the cell itself doesn't have any elements on it. Cool? All right, so remember we're registering a UI collection view cell, not a UI collection view. Did everybody get their cells populated? Can we scroll our cells? The train is leaving. Margiette, how you doing? It's not showing. Did you give it a background color? Where's my?
You left your account at 50.
Yeah. All right, did everybody get their cell to show up? Yes, sir. PID error. Does your cell show up? Can you put a breakpoint in your cell for all? Yeah. No, it doesn't constrain it to all four sides. It makes the frame basically 0. You have to set, like 0 means you won't see it, right? But we have to go to constraints to, to set them to the edges, yeah. But again, it's very similar to like saying int equals to 0 or string equals to empty string. Like a quick way to initialize an empty object. Yeah. All right, everybody got their cells? The self is very similar to when we say JSON decoder. It's referencing the class itself, right? Greg, you had a question?
No, I was saying I had the same error and I started on the computer fix it.
Okay. Now, yeah, those are not the best ones, right? But yeah, because yeah, cool. All right, so we're good. All right, let's continue. I want to show us how to change the size in code like we did before. So we'll change the size in code. We gave it earlier, we gave it a default size, 400 by 400, right? So now you experiment already? Okay, no, that's good. What did you use? What function?
I was just checking this out.
Okay. Good. That's how we learn. Yeah, we'll do it now. So let's go ahead and let's go to our view did load. View did load, and let's implement our delegate here. The delegate for the cell, for the collection view, sorry. And we'll go below our extension for our data source, and we'll have an extension for our delegate, and we'll implement item size, right? So we all have collection view that delegate equal to self, correct? Okay, so let's continue on. So right at the bottom of my code here, I'll have an extension on my podcast view controller, UI collection view, flow delegate, collection view, delegate flow layout. And we'll implement type in item and press enter. Type in item and press enter. Again, typing in item will bring up the function we need, size for item at, and we press enter when it comes up. Are you conforming to UI collection view delegate flow layout? And make sure you say in podcast view controller.
Yes, and then we choose item and collection view size for
Don't just press item.
Make sure it's
Size for item.
Make sure it's delegate flow layout.
Oh, it's delegate flow layout.
Thank you, Mr. Eric. So item size. So what does this function do? It returns a CG size. What's a CG size? A CG size is a tuple which has a width of the item and the height of the item, okay? So here in the view controller, at this point we could know our screen width and height, correct? What are we going to use for this? To find out what the maximum width is of the device? Yulia? What do we use? What's the class that we use if we want to know the screen dimensions of the device? UI screen, right? So UI screen.main. So here we'll create some max size here of CG. It's a CG size. And we say UI screen dot main dot bounds.
Wait, you have to say that it's a CG size, but
That
you
size.
automatically know,
You have to type annotated
no? It's better to do that.
for that particular case, yes. It's very similar to like CG float. If you don't type annotate CG float, it might think that's an int.
Gotcha.
And when you start doing multiplications or whatever, it will say, hey, can't do int with float. Okay, I want to talk about bounds like lightly here. Bounds and frame, because we've been using bounds and frame. I want to talk about it. We'll keep talking about it, but I just want to talk about it right now. When you hear the frame of something, right? So if I'm talking about myself, right? I'm standing here in the classroom. Everybody pay attention here. I'm standing here in the classroom. If I say, what's my frame? My frame is the surrounding 4 sides of this room. Everybody, right? Everybody, right? My bounds is relative to myself. What's my bounds? My bounds here is relative to myself. My bounds would be 0, 0. It would be whatever my width and my height is. In that case, my width is 36 inches, call it that. My height is 6'3", call it that, right? Okay? My bounds is relative to myself. My frame is relative to where I am in location to the class. So picture if this is an iPhone, 0, 0 would be where? Here, right? Close to the door, right, everybody? 0, 0 would be close to the door. If this is 400 pixels, I might be right at 300 pixels, right? On the x-axis, right? On the y-axis, I might be like 20. Everybody with me? So my frame is relative to the classroom. My bounds is relative to myself, okay? Those are one of the interview questions. You'll get those. I like how when I say the interview question, you reiterate it. I like to use the classroom analogy, right? Because if somebody tells me what's my frame relative to where my super view would be the classroom, right? Because remember, when we do auto layout, what do? We make a view relative to something else, correct? So in that case, if I'm using frame-based layout, for me to lay myself out, how would I lay myself out? But based on the numbers I said, how would I lay myself out? My x and y, what would it be? Right, so my x would be 300, my y would be 20, and my width would be?
Oh, it would be 6'3".
Wow.
I mean, your height is 6'3".
I'm a whale. Okay.
And then your width is.
My width is 36 inches, whatever. My height is 6'3", right? So that's how you lay me out based on my frame, right? Everybody? So
you said your banner. No, you said it's frame and what?
frame is in relation. My frame is in relation to where I am in my super view.
Right, and then what was the second?
The bounds
Your bounds is
in relation to myself. Yes. Cool.
Frame, big, bounds.
You wrote it down somewhere?
I wrote it down.
Here on this because I don't want to say to my interviewer.
They'll keep coming back. They'll
Bring
keep.
to the classroom.
No, that's fine. You could use a phone or you could use a classroom. You could use the iPhone. If you're laying out a box on the phone, the frame of that box would be relative to the super view of where the box is. A blue box in the center of the phone, right? The frame would be relative to its super view, which is the device, right?
And balance is
Relative to itself.
or wherever you have to that
Exactly.
item.
It was just relative to itself. So the x there and the y would be 0, 0. Yes.
Is it like frame is like location?
To find my location, you have to know my frame.
And bounds is like size?
Bounds will give you size. Both of them will give you size, by the way. Both frame and bounds, you'll get the size of the object. But for the location, you would need the frame. Cool? Very good. Okay. We'll come back to those. Come back to them again and again. Okay, so we have max size here. What are we trying to do? Okay, what are we returning? We're returning the CG size. So just return the CG size here. CG size. And we said the CG size is a tuple of 2 values. The width, I'll come back to those, but let's create an item. Let's create an item width here of CG float. Again, we have to annotate that CG float here. So the item width will say it's max size dot width with some percentage. We'll say 95%. So this is 95% of the width of device. Okay, so here we return item width, and here we return 120. That's the calculation for our cell size. So yes, we started off with 400 by 400, but we could come here and override those numbers, right? In the initializer of our collection view, it was 400 by 400 for the layout, but we could come here on the delegate and say, hey, my item size recalculated. We override it, right? Right here. So we could say over the default values of the item size there from the collection view property initializer in the podcast view. Okay, so if we run our app, we now have smaller cells there, right? And again, you could play with the numbers based on what you want. Here we see the height is 120. Here we see the width is 95% of the width of the device. So you could play with the numbers there with what you want. But this is basically what cell we want. Okay. So we've done our setup for our view controller basically in code. No storyboard. Next step, let's go create that zip. This is the wrong function. There's no item size map. There's no item size map. This function says position item size. Type in item size. Type in item size. Oh, remove it.
Well, you could do it here, or you could do it like the way we did it originally, I guess. You mean like here? Not here.
How are we doing? Can we go create our zip?
Oh, you're saying like in the cell?
Can we go create our zip?
I don't think so. I think that's more.
Yes, no, maybe? Okay.
This is where you
So our view controller is basically set up. Let's go create our zip, right? So if we go back to our little diagram here, we did the podcast view controller in code. Now let's go ahead and do our zip. Our zip will be a collection view cell. Let's go create that. So new file, somewhere. New file. It's an empty view. So select empty view. Go to user interface. We see storyboard, we see empty view. Select empty view. The empty view, the name will be podcast cell. Yeah, you see the empty view there?
User interface, empty.
Yeah. Oh, you're looking for the word view, sorry. Empty. I gotta be specific. Okay, podcast cell, right? Yes? You could copy the podcast cell, copy the string that you just typed in, because the class will be the same. So podcast cell and create. And immediately, let's go create a cell class. So create a new file, CocoaTouch class, and it is subclass of what?
collection.
Awesome. UI collection view cell. Very good. And I just paste in what I just copied. It's a podcast cell. So I have a podcast cell.zib, which we just created. And now I have a podcast cell.swift file. I want it to be empty. I don't want it to have any view. Very good question. You could remove it, but it's easier to start from scratch in that case. Less problems. Okay, so now we have two podcast cell things. We have one podcast cell.zib and one podcast cell.swift. Yes? We want to drag in we don't want any view or anything. We'll drag in a UI collection view cell. Then you have to remove that view it has, because we don't want to have a view on a cell on top of the view. We just want to have a basic cell. Okay? So when you're doing it, please use an empty view. Okay, next step, let's go to our zib. Zib, zib, zib. Zib, nib, again, interchangeable there. So now we're in our Xibs canvas, very similar to Storyboard. We're in our Xibs canvas, okay? We should have an empty canvas. We go over to the object library, and we search for cell, and we drag in, what cell are we dragging in? Collection view cell. Okay? I dragged in a collection view cell. Yeah, we did it once before. Very good, very good. We did it in the break, or the return from the break. So here we have our collection view cell. I could give it some background color for now. I'll just give it white.
Do we want to give it an identifier?
Yes, we will, but not yet. We'll get there, for sure. Okay, so step one, let's go ahead and change the height of it. So I'll go to the size inspector. I'll click on my cell. I'll click on the cell. I'll go to size inspector, and I'll change my height to 120. Does that 120, does that height affect my app itself? No, that's just for working. You're working with your view. You want to see what it looks like as far as like the height and exactly what it's going to look like, but that's not the final height. The final height will be in our item size. Okay, what do we want to drag? We want to drag in an image view. So make sure that in the document outline, you're clicking on the cell. So use the document outline, right? So make sure you click on the cell to get to the height of it, right? Okay, so we have our image view. Let's go to the size inspector to change the size of our image view. Image view, 120 by 120. 120 by 120. Okay, and let's set the constraints for our image view. We mix in here, right? You missed what? Oh, you missed this? Okay, so let's set our constraints. So here we have my image view. I'll say top 0, leading 0, bottom 0. And I will make the height and the width 120, right? And we add 5 constraints. Perfect. And we'll change our image. We'll give it a default image. We go to Attribute Inspector. I'll select Mike. Mike Phil is fine. Yes, sir.
When setting up the constraints for the UI view, sometimes it, like, even though I set it to 0 standard.
Do 0.01. That's a slight bug on some machines or Xcodes. So do 0.01 for the 3 edges. Yeah.
I didn't know this, zero on top, bottom, and leading.
Yeah. And then the height and the width is 120.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let us go to our assistant editor. Open up your assistant editor. Assistant editor.
My thing is not giving me a mic person.
It's not giving you a mic? Why doesn't it want to give you a mic?
When I press it, it's not coming up. I'm just changing the color.
One second, sorry. Let me set up my Xcode here. So, assistant editor, yeah, the class of the cell. Where's my cell? My cell is here. Okay, so let's make sure we have our zip file or zip our cell next to our podcast cell class. And open up our attributes inspector. And as Tiffany was saying earlier, let us go ahead and select our collection view cell. Select our collection view cell. And we want to go ahead and change the cell class name. So select the custom class in identity inspector for the cell. What are we changing it to? Podcast cell. Press enter. And what else do we need to do? Reuse identifier, as Luba says. So the reuse identifier is podcast, lowercase podcast, cell, enter. Right? So podcast cell for the reuse identifier. Make sure that you change the class identifier, the class name to podcast cell, and identifier is camel case podcast cell. Yeah.
Any reason that maybe they have microphone on my end?
We all have SS symbols, right?
You have your skin color. Is it white? Because I had changed my background color to white, but I pressed the skin color that I had.
Could be that.
So if you change that back to blue, the blue that you use.
Thank you, Tiffany.
No, it's
Also an IA.
thank you.
All right. Cool. Let's go ahead and control drag from our image view over to our cell class. So control drag from our image view
And then also
over to our cell class. And we'll call this podcast image view podcast image view connect. Connect. Okay. Before we go any further, I just want to verify that it works. And then we'll come back and we'll set up the labels. So make sure that before you leave here, you have the reuse identifier and you have the custom class set to podcast cell. Okay? So what are we saying? Make sure that in your attributes here for your cell, make sure identifier is podcast cell, and make sure our class is podcast cell, and we press enter. Okay? And then let's go back to our view controller. Okay, back to the view controller. In our view did load, we saw one way to set up a cell. We set up a cell programmatically using collection view.register cell. Okay? We'll see a way to set up a cell using a nib or zib. So next stop here, or register collection view cell using zib or nib. Okay. So we'll comment this out. So remember, collection view register cell, that's a default cell. here. But now we want to get the cell from a zip. Everybody? I want to get the cell from a zip. So what does that look like? I'll say podcast view, view, sorry. Collection view dot register nib. So before we did register cell, now we're doing register with nib. The nib is the zip we created. Yes?
Why are nib and zip?
Because nib stands for Next Interface Builder, and the zip is the actual extension. .zip, right? So that's why they're very interchangeable with like saying what they are. That's it. Cool? Zip is the extension. Like a nib is the thing. Like before we had Interface Builder was separate. And then with Steve Jobs' company, it was NIB, so Next Interface Builder. It's instead of saying storyboard, it's a nib file, right? But the extension is zip. Okay? They're interchangeable. They're not different things. Yes? You what? Connect your cell. Okay, cool. So we're registering a nib. We start off with UI NIB, and we say nib with name, which we did over the break, right? So nib with name here, press enter. The name of our nib is podcast cell. Bundle identifier is nil. And ID, sorry. Bundle identifier is nil. Come on. Bundle identifier is nil. And the reuse identifier is podcast cell. Okay. So we'll see two ways to do things programmatically, right? All right. Great. So now we have our nib. Let's go update our cell for row item. Because right now our cell for row item, what cell does it return? What type of cell?
Not the UI collection view.
Right, it just returns a UI collection view cell. So we want to go and update that to return a podcast cell. Okay?
Podcast.
Yes, the one we just registered here. We want to go use it, right? Because before the one we registered was a regular UI collection view cell, right? Let's continue on and update our cell for row or cell for item. Guard. Let's typecast it to our podcast cell. And with an hour?
No, with our, the cell that's in.
When you run run without changing this here, it uses it anyway.
With the UI collection view cell?
Yeah.
You might not be able to change the configurations of it later, right?
But the podcast cell that this is using now, is it the podcast cell that's the?
And go ahead.
Because we have two. We have the Swift, which is the class for it. I mean, not the we have two here. We have the podcast cell that we gave the image view, and then we had a podcast cell. But the podcast cell that we gave the image view, was that for the zip that we did?
Yes.
Okay, so
They work together.
Okay, so in this one, we put as podcast cell, would it know?
Yes, because right now we're downcasting it to the podcast cell.
So
Before we had a generic cell, so we couldn't say cell dot image
it was
view.
a generic cell, it was just a regular.
Exactly.
This one now is custom, gotcha.
Exactly. So this is back to like what we regularly do. So here we have our background color, which is white. That's fine. Okay, let's just run the app and verify that our thing shows, and we'll continue. Okay, that's fine. This time. Are we okay to continue?
Why does it work as without that?
Without this here. So if we go to a generic cell here, with that generic cell, right? So what does it do? It dequeues the podcast cell. It finds this generic cell here. We registered the cell here. Where's the cell? It will use, you remember we spoke about polymorphism, right? So it will take that cell, it will downcast it automatically. But as far as like we trying to access the properties on that cell, we won't be able to do it, right? Does that make sense? When we talk back with inheritance there, okay? It sees a cell, it just shows it, because we registered it already. I'm coming over. Just say it and I'll be there, okay? I'm only the person here, so
That's what I was saying. Is there anybody?
But raise your hand, we'll wait for it. Okay? I'll be right there for you. Okay, let me slide this over. Guard here. All right, so I'll stack it over to you, Mel. Okay? But raise your hand the minute you have that first error. Cool? Desktop, this guy. Okay, Mel, you good to go? All right. Okay, let's continue on. Let's continue. We're good to go for the next 40 minutes, right? We're good for 40 minutes? Yes. Oh, it was about polymorphism. So inheritance, it looks for the cell, it sees the cell, it displays the cell. As far as like accessing the properties on the cell, we won't be able to do it without downcasting. Okay, so let's continue on. Not this. Okay, so we have our table view, still works as normal. I almost want to segue first before we continue with other properties. So let's segue first, okay? When I click on a cell, I want to segue to my detail controller. Okay, everybody?
You know, for the longest, I was looking for my main storyboard to look at
It doesn't exist, right? Okay, so when we click on, okay, you write in this application, you want to, when you select a row, get notified. What more function are we implementing? Index path. Did select, okay. So did select here in our delegate method right here, right below our item size, we'll say did select. So this is the function, right? Did select item at. When I click on a cell, this function gets called. All right, come on, don't say that.
Not you, me.
I know it's not me. Comedy hour. All right. So let us just write a simple print statement here to verify that this works. So podcast dot collection name, for example. Okay. So we have our did select item. When I click on it, what I want to see printed is the podcast, but we need some more code here. Right now, we're returning a hard-coded 50. That's not going to work. Can we move up to our number of rows? Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay, so number of rows, we're not returning 50 anymore. We are returning podcast.count. What's podcast.count right now? Pop quiz. 0. Very good. Why is it 0?
Because we haven't given any information.
Very good. Okay, so we call our fetch podcast. We call fetch podcast here. It sets it here. So in reality, it's not 0, actually. Right?
Where?
Here, because our fetch podcast got called.
But we have a podcast. We have oh, it's from the internet. Oh, so it's whatever it's from the
I like how you answer your questions. Okay, in our podcast did set, we need to call, what code am I writing here? I'm coming from a background thread. Dispatch queue dot main dot async self dot podcast view dot collection view, reload the data. All right, so that's enough information for us to test. At this point, we're not returning a hard-coded 50 anymore. We're returning whatever the count of podcasts we found. Right here, line 18, 17, 19, 17, 18, 19. It's about 200-ish. The limit is 200. I set the limit to 200 podcast returns. Cool? All right, so if we run it again, actually I ran it already. If I click on a cell, we should just see the collection names pop up. Do we see the podcast names, the titles? Right, so I click random things, Swift by Sandel. How many people listen to Swift by Sandel? Okay, just try, just keep going there, keep going there. We need to listen to more iOS podcasts, right? It's not homework. It's happy work, right? It's travel work, yes. All right, so this works. Purple error, why? Why did you get a purple error? Yes, you're on the wrong thread. You need to be on the main thread to update UI. All right, okay. Our API is working, our cell selection is working. Now let's take a tangent and go work on our storyboard file. Because right now we have no storyboard, but I want to segue to some view controller that's from a storyboard file. So we'll create 2 files. We'll create one file called podcast detail storyboard. I will create a next file called podcast detail view controller.
You do Programmatic and Storyboard together. Do you not have to do the setup that you do in FOPs for Programmatic still, or you still have to?
If you start from storyboard, you don't have to, no.
Or you start Programmatic?
Yes. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like if you start in, so Eric's question is, if your application, if you want to start your application programmatically, right, you use the scene delegate, you set up your views there, right? But if you're coming from storyboard, you do it as we always did, and then you could go back and forth.
Do you still need to do the setup?
No. Unless you could do a couple of things. You could rename your storyboard, you could delete the storyboard, keep the same main storyboard, that's fine, right? But what we're learning today is how to separate our storyboard files. And then you could create a storyboard for each view controller, which makes it easier to work with, especially on a team, right? One person works on login view controller, somebody else works on shopping cart view controller, whatever it is there. That way you have less merge conflicts. Because as we see our first, I'm talking about merge conflicts right now, we haven't seen it yet, but when we go on our first group project, if we attempt to use one storyboard, the hair pulling out thing might happen. But again, it's better seen in practice. You'll get over it, you'll know best practices and all that stuff there. But we're trying to lead you in the best practice approach earlier than when you get there. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and create some files. Where am I going to create those files? Files. We have a view. We'll create it right here. All right, so create a new file. First one will be a storyboard file. This is the first time, again, we're creating a storyboard file. Some other people might have created before, but as a class, we're creating a storyboard file. Every time before that, we've seen a default main.storyboard, right? But today, we'll create our own storyboard file. Very similar to what we just created, the Xib, right? But here, you could drag in view controllers and all that sort of stuff there. So storyboard, click next, and our name will be podcast. Let me zoom in here. Podcast detail. That's all. There's no need, or you're not putting any extension like we've not done yet, but the extension will be .storyboard. So it's a storyboard file, .storyboard. So podcast detail, we press create. We call it podcast detail. It's a storyboard file. Okay, along with the storyboard file, we'll create a view controller. So new file, Cocoa Touch class. What's my subclass here? UI view controller. Thank you, sir. UI view controller. And I'm gonna call this guy podcast detail controller. Keep the names the same, minus the controller part. It's subclass UI view controller, and press next, and press create. Podcast detail controller. Okay, two files. Let's go over to our storyboard, our podcast detail storyboard. And we are dragging in a view controller. We're dragging in a view controller, and we'll keep it simple. We'll just have an image view and a label. So let's get an image view. Image view. Image view. We'll set the constraints, use the blue guidelines, nothing too fancy here. Set the constraints, so go ahead, add constraints. We have 0 top, we have 20, 20, and we have, actually just make it 0 here. So 0, 0, and a height of 400. So 0, 0, 0, and a height of 400. 0 top, 0 lead-in, 0 trailing, and a height of 400. Cool. We'll have a default image. We'll go back to our mic. And 400 for the height. All right, so we have our image view with a placeholder image. And next, we will have some label here for the artist name. And this label, we'll set the constraints for it at 20, bottom of the image, 20 lead-in, 20 trailing, 3 constraints. And we'll change the number of lines for it to say 3 or 0. Just, no, not 0. Make it 3 or 4. 4 lines is fine. 20 top, 20 lead-in, 20 trailing. Yes?
So what's the difference between making 0
0 is just going to go all the way to the bottom if it's really long, and it will get cut off at the bottom. 4 here says make it 4 lines and then use ellipsis on the 4th line if it's longer.
Oh, okay. With the dot. Okay.
Cool? Very good. But we don't have a scroll view there, so there's no need to make the thing grow more than 4 lines or to 0.
Because even if it's at 0, it can keep on going.
Yeah, exactly.
No more
Exactly.
phone, then you can see anything
It
else.
will be cut off, yeah. But for now, 4 is fine here. Not scroll view, exact lesson here. This is fine. Okay, cool. Let's change the class name of it. Did we change the class name yet? No. So let's give it a class name. Click on your view controller and go change the class name. What's the class name? Very good. So here, podcast detail controller, press enter. So our storyboard is pretty much good to go. Let us get to the assistant editor and drag out the outlets. Okay, so I have my view controller next to my scene here. I'll go ahead and control drag from my image view over to my detail controller. I'll call this podcast image view. And next I have a label, which is artist name. I'll control drag from the artist name over to my view controller, and I'll call it artist name label connect. Awesome. Great, great, great. How are we doing so far? So far, so good? Uh-huh. Oh, it should print, right? It doesn't print for you? Okay, let's go back to that. So our first view controller, let me just change this position here. Our view controller at the bottom here, you're saying this does not work for you? Are you conform to the delegate, right? Did your item size work earlier? Okay. And here you call in did select item at. Do you have a, so you have a print statement there, correct? Let me just come over and see what's going on. Okay, so we have, let's go back here, where are we? So we have our cells. When we click on the cell, Lily, I'll take a look in a while. So when I click on the cell here, I should see the name of the podcast that I selected. Next, what we want to do is segue. We want to segue from that cell selection over to the detail controller, okay? We've seen it already in the past, but we'll do it again together to glue the pieces together here. So I have my podcast cell. Let's go over to our detail controller and give it a podcast. So here, I'm in my detail controller. I'm giving it a podcast. In my detail controller, I give it a podcast. Great, great, great. Let's clean up some code here. We'll have some sort of update UI here. So private function update UI. Update UI will unwrap our podcast as podcast mini here. And here we'll say fatal error. Did not load a podcast from Segway. And here we have a podcast. So let's go ahead and update some of our elements. So let's start off with the artist label. So we'll say artist label dot text equal to podcast dot artist name. Then we go out to our image. We will say podcast image view. Make sure to import image kit here. So import image kit. Make sure you import image kit. And image kit gives us access to our get image extension. So here we'll say podcast image view dot get image. Use get image with completion, not the one that says write to directory. So get image with string completion. And the string we're passing in is the podcast image we want. In our case, we want the bigger one, so pass in the artwork URL 600. And here we have some results. Oscar, how you doing? Cool. So here we have our result. We'll switch on our result. Here we might have some error. Just gonna break here for now to do update default image. And here we have success, which is the image. If we have the image, we on a background thread, we need to come back to the main thread to update our UI. Mr. Jahid will say, make sure you say weak self here to break any return cycles. We'll come back here, we'll say self.podcast image equal to image. Okay? And we'll make sure to call update UI here. Yeah. Yeah. Wherever we are in 15 minutes, we'll stop, because at this point, we'll have enough context to be able to continue with the labs. Does that make sense? Because so far, we've seen programmatic controllers, we've seen storyboard controllers, we've seen the Xibs. Does that make sense? Okay. The rest is just filling them out. Like the cell, for example, is just setting the label and then set the label on the cell. But the foundation is there. Okay, so we have our update UI. Can we continue? We good? Okay, let's go back to our view controller, and now we need to segue, right? So here, we want to segue to the podcast detail controller, and we want to access the podcast detail controller from Storyboard. So that's a bit new, what we'll be doing. In the past, what storyboard have we been using? We've been using the instance, right, of the view controller storyboard, which is the default main storyboard, which it knows about from the info plist. But right now, it doesn't know about it, right? We have to get it using the name of the storyboard. So we want to access the podcast detail controller. Did we give it an ID? Okay, so let's make sure we give it an ID and come right back. So let's leave this and come right back. Let's go to our podcast detail storyboard and give it an identifier, which is also important here. So copy the class name, and paste it in where it says storyboard ID and press enter, right? So copy the class name, podcast detail controller, paste it in where it says storyboard ID. Keeps it simple. Okay. And now we'll go back to our segue stuff. All right, great. So we have a storyboard ID, we have everything we need. So make sure that the storyboard ID is set for the podcast detail controller, which we did. And now we'll get the instance from storyboard. First, we need to get the storyboard. We need to get the storyboard. Yes? Get image, make sure you import in image kit. So right below UI kit, import image kit. Cool. All right, so let's continue on. So here, let's get the access to the storyboard. So we'll say let podcast detail storyboard equal to we're using the UI storyboard class to get a storyboard. So UI storyboard initializer with name. What's the name? That name is the same name that we gave our storyboard file. What's the name that we gave our storyboard file? Podcast detail, right? The same name that we gave our storyboard file back here. Right? Do we see podcast detail, that storyboard? Everybody sees that? That's the name that you pass in. Right? If you started with lowercase, which you should not, right? It would be lowercase p. But here we have podcast detail, right? So that's what we're referring to. When we're referring to the name, that's the name. Everybody? Awesome.
You want to name it storyboard?
No storyboard, just podcast detail. Make sure it's spelled the same way. And bundle is nil. So here we have the storyboard that we're interested in. Again, you could have many storyboards. Yes? What is what? Bundle is all the resources you have in your application. Images, everything you have in your application. MP3 files, whatever you have in your application, right? Remember back in our JSON class, right? We said bundle.main to read the data. So we are reading from the JSON file. And that was in our bundle, our app bundle. Cool. Podcast detail, storyboard, awesome. What's the next step? Now we have a storyboard. What's the next step here? Instantiate using that storyboard the view controller identifier, right? So we'll start off by saying guard here. And we will say podcast detail controller equal to, as Tiffany says, we'll use the podcast instance we have, and we'll say instantiate with identifier. Instantiate view controller with identifier. What's the identifier? The identifier is the same name as the class, and the class is podcast view controller. No, podcast detail controller. And we typecast it to the type. Podcast detail controller.
What's the difference between identifier and with identifier? Identifier is when you're,
Wait, let me backtrack here. You're saying instantiate with,
there's instantiate the controller identifier string, and then it says instantiate the controller with identifier string. What's the difference?
those might be older APIs. Creates the view controller from specified initializers from data, and this newer one here creates an everything. Those are the same thing, right? The earlier one here is most likely tied to all Objective-C, right? Where there was always like a with identifier or for whatever it is, like longer names spells out. At some point, this is going to disappear. Okay, so identifier here. Let me backspace here. Okay. So fatal error over here. And what are we saying? We're saying could not downcast to not this. Could not downcast to podcast detail controller. Here we have a podcast detail controller. We also have a podcast. We could remove the print statement. So now let's go ahead and set that up. So podcast detail controller will get a podcast because we want to pass that data over to the detail controller in order for it to have a podcast. In the coming weeks, or next week, we will pass data using initializers dependency injection. We'll fully use dependency injection in the coming weeks, right? Whether it be Storyboard or Programmatic, we'll use an initializer on the view controller to say, view controller, I instantiate you with a podcast. So that way we could make our podcast private. Everybody with me? Right? Everybody with me? That's where we headed. We want to make our podcast private in the future weeks or next week coming up. But now this is enough, but we are not done. Are we done? No. In a prepare for segue, we would be done. But here, we manually segueing over, we are not done. What container are we in? Our view controller is embedded in what? Let me bring up the app here. What's my view controller embedded in? It's embedded in a navigation controller. So do I have access to the navigation controller object? Right? Is it nil? No, right? It's not nil. So I could go ahead and use my navigation controller object property and say navigation controller, I want to go ahead and push a new view controller onto the stack. The new view controller you push in is my podcast detail controller. Okay? So with prepare for segue, this step, we don't use that step because it's already segueing. But here we need to manually say, I selected a cell, navigation controller, go ahead and push a new view controller onto the stack, okay? You might also see, I'm not gonna use it right now, but you might also see show view controller, where you could simply say show podcast detail controller, sender nil, right? This is a newer API, and that API works for both iPhone and iPad. Because on iPad, if you have a split view controller, which we'll see at some point, it knows where it is. So if it's a split view controller, it knows to show some other detail controller, right? If it's a navigation controller, it knows to push. So that's a more up-to-date API, the show API, okay? But we should also know our navigation controller API. Cool. Yeah, so it's gonna be something like this. So we'll say podcast detail controller. If you want a podcast, I'll give you a podcast via an initializer. Like that. And my podcast will be private. Because so far we've been making our podcast public. Anybody could access it. Right? We know what happens there. So we'll make our code tighter as far as like defensive, encapsulated, object-oriented. So we'll encapsulate the podcast as a private property using initializers. Okay, cool. So now we could go ahead and test it out. If I click on a cell, I should be able to segue and see what the podcast is. Taylor Swift, look at that. Right? Different podcasts. Sweet by Sandel. I did not try this by accident. Okay. Are we able to segue? After, we'll come there. Are we able to segue? Mel, how you doing? Are you passing your podcast? Pass your podcast and make sure you call in update UI. So back in our detail controller, make sure in your view did load, you call in update UI. David, are you able to segue and see your podcast? Cool. Christian? Great. Eric? Where are you? What's the crash say? Yulia?
Storyboard. So you want to go to the storyboard file and see what the ID is. This guy paste exactly what we have here. I press enter. See what the ID is, see what the access is in here. Here, podcast detail controller. Paste that here. That's what the error was. I didn't know what this out.
No, you're great.
I was like, you listen to in transit. It's like, I said this before you, like, when I'm in transit, I'm
You're very close. I'm gonna help you. Benvenido, how you doing? Good? Luba? You good at Julia is crashing? Okay, we're very close to ending this project. Anybody who has any errors will come and help you afterwards. But basically, the app is where we want it to be. We were able to, let me go back through our notes. We first created a podcast view controller. We were able to create our podcast view controller in code. We did that. Second thing we did, we created a zip file, right? .zip file with an image. And yes, we did not add the two labels, but that's trivial. So we created a zip file. We were able to access our zip file we registered our zip file on the podcast view controller, right? We saw two different ways to register a cell. Registering a cell using like a class or a custom class, registering a cell using a nib, which is what we did here. We created a podcast detail controller storyboard, and we created a podcast detail storyboard, and we created a podcast detail controller. So we were able to create different facets of UI and access it, right? So they're all working together. So we're able to mix and match or mix programming code with storyboard code with zip as well, right? The only thing we didn't do today was Swift UI, but yeah, 7.0, right? So we got that working, and our app looks like this. It segues correctly, right? It shows the image. Yes, we could also show the image. We could have a configure cell and show the image, but this is not the objective of the day. The objective of the day was to mix programmable code with storyboard and zip code, right? Cool? So we have a lab today, very similar to this. You set up a collection view, you segue, and you could create either a custom class, just use a custom class cell, or you could create a zip file as well, okay? Yes? I also want to touch one thing before we continue here. So back in our view controller, let's go to view did load here.
Oh, you mean like when you did the UI collection, you mean that?
Yeah, so instead of doing the zip, let me just stop for a second. Instead of just doing the zip here, not the zip, sorry. Instead of saying UI collection view cell, I could say podcast cell without using the zip. Everybody with me? I could do everything in code without using the zip. Everybody with me? And then instead of registering, we would not register a zip. We would do this option, and instead of saying UI collection view cell, what would we say? Podcast cell, right? But all the code would be in that class. Everybody with me?
Which code you talking about?
Whatever code, image stuff you need would be, it wouldn't be an IB IB outlet.
Right. Kind of like what we did with the view, right?
With yesterday, exactly. So all the code we did yesterday, that would be in the in the cell class. No zips, right? So you could do your cell with zips, you could do your cell without zips, right? You could do your cells from storyboards. At this point, you've seen all ways to do cells in UIKit. Yes, you've seen all ways to do cells. Cool? Okay. Any other questions? Show of hands, who has the code in a not working state? Okay, cool. So we'll work with you guys together. And then other people that's done, what you want to happen is go work on our labs, right? Work on our programmatic lab. And then tomorrow we'll start with linked list tomorrow. So like read ahead on that and we'll start with linked list tomorrow. Cool? Good? All right, perfect. Thank you.